But in an actual game, if you're sitting here with the black pieces and these pawns are marching down the board, you might get a little nervous. Today's game has the highest rated player to ever play the jobava-london system. This is Magnus Carlsen at a rating of 2876. This was a banter blitz game with Niels Grandelius. The game itself was not rated, but the level of the players is the highest it can possibly be. Magnus has the white pieces as he's playing the jobava-london system. Niels Grandelius has the black pieces. Let's get started. It begins with d4, knight f6, knight c3, d5, bishop to f4. We now have the jobava-london. The immediate threat is the idea of knight to b5, threatening to take on c7. So black stops that immediately with a6, controlling the b5 square, e3 to liberate the bishop at f1, e6. And here Magnus plays the most aggressive move on the board. You can play knight to f3, but why bother? Play aggressively with g4, immediately aiming to gain space on the king's side and kick the knight at f6 away from its comfortable position. c5, Grandelius immediately attacks white's central pawn at d4. g5, going ahead and kicking that knight. The knight goes to d7. And now knight to f3. Queen f3 is also a possibility here, but knight f3 seems to be maybe the better move. Knight to c6, black piles onto the d4 square. The knight and the pawn both hit d4. h4. Carlsen continues to expand on the king side, and Grandelius expands on the queen side. Plays b5, potentially kicking that knight at c3 away with tempo, gaining even more space. So Carlsen preempts that by going ahead and moving the knight to e2, perhaps rerouting it over to the king side before it can be kicked away. Knight to b6. The knight at b6 can go to c4, can go to a4, hitting that b2 pawn. c3, strengthening this central structure, the dark square strategy that white is playing with. Bishop to d6. Grandelius immediately challenges the bishop on f4, and Carlsen says, I don't mind if he exchanges it. I'm going to continue with my plan, and he plays h4, h5, and you see he begins to continue expanding, and this h5 move is a novelty in this position, and black can start to ask, where is his king going to be safe? Now, white might want to ask that question too, but black's king is a little more vulnerable. Now, the computers think all of this stuff is equal, but in an actual game, if you're sitting here with the black pieces and these pawns are marching down the board, you might get a little nervous when that happens. Bishop to b7, placing the bishop on the long diagonal. It's not open at the moment. Bishop to h3. So what Magnus is doing, he's aiming right at this e6 pawn. He's attacking this e6, f7 pawn structure. The threat is to play g6, and after the exchanges take place, this pawn will end up being undefended. That's the idea here. The only downside is that the rook at h8 will get an open file, so he has to deal with that. Queen to e7 defends that e6 pawn. Takes on d6, queen d6, dc5, queen c5. So what he's done is he's drawn that queen away from the defense of the e6 pawn with those two exchanges. Takes the bishop, takes the pawn, the queen is no longer defending e6. So what does he do? Boom, g6. Now that the pawn is more vulnerable, he plays g6, undermining it. hg6, hg6, and now f6. Otherwise, he's just going to take on f7 with check. And the only thing keeping Magnus from just grabbing on e6, of course, is that there is a pin on the h-file. So he'll have to find a way to deal with that, so he can't take yet. He plays the knight at e2 to d4. That does hit the e6 pawn. And Grandelius responds with e5, kicking that knight away. But the knight has some interesting options in this position. He plays the knight to f5. Immediately attacking the g7 pawn, threatening to take the pawn with check. Instead of defending the pawn, though, Grandelius counterattacks with bishop to c8. He pins the knight against this bishop. The rook is also attacking it. And here, if he were to take on g7, then king to f8 actually wins a piece, because if the knight returns, then bishop takes knight, and now this bishop cannot recapture because it would be pinned. So after bishop to c8, what Carlsen does is he plays knight 3 to h4. he blocks that file and renews the threat. Rook to a7 directly defends the g7 pawn. However, this bishop at c8 is now under-defended. The knight at b6 defends it, but it could become vulnerable a little bit later. The queen goes to f3. The threat is to take on g7 and then play queen takes f6. Give up a knight for 2 pawns, but in exchange, you'd have a dominating position, a vulnerable king, and a passed pawn on g6. So knight to a4 is played, aiming at b2, and this allows Carlsen to play his idea. Grandelius is saying, you can play that, but I'm going to go after your king on e1, and I think I can get it. Knight g7 check, rook takes g7, queen takes f6, of course attacking the rook at g7. So rook h to g8 defends, but now bishop takes c8. That bishop is no longer defended. The rook had moved, the knight had moved. So that restores 2 minor pieces to both sides. But now knight takes b2. And white's king can be in a little bit of trouble. The queen can come to c3 with check. The knight can go to d3. So Carlsen's going to have to find a way to save that king. And his next move makes sense. It's bishop to e6, but it's actually a mistake. And it really takes a computer to figure this out. He's attacking the defender of the rook at g7. Looks like he's going to win material. It turns out the better move was bishop to g4. The idea is that this bishop can return to defend his king, and it also blocks the g-file. And we'll see why that is important here in a second. And after bishop to e6, Grandelius plays queen takes c3 check. King to e2. King to f1 was probably the better option, but it looks like black at least has a perpetual check in this position. King to e2, queen to c2 check, king to f1, queen to d3, and here, if he were to play king to g2, he would lose, because rook takes g6 check, knight takes, rook takes g6 check, attacking the king and the queen, and the bishop defends the rook, so he would lose, and you can see now why, if this bishop were on g4, it would block that check, and that was one of the ideas behind it. So he can't go to g2. He has to move the king back into the center to e1, queen to c3 check, king to e2, and in this position, Grandelius decides to play for the win. Queen to c4 check, king to e1, now knight to d3 check, king to d2, and it turns out the move he should have played here was rook to f8, attacking the queen, and after, say, bishop to f7, he takes twice on f7 and queen to e6 check, and we have a very messy position. But instead, he plays queen to b4 check, and now Carlsen takes the knight with his king, and he feels he can survive this potential onslaught. Queen to c4 check, and now his king can escape. King to d2, queen to b4 check, now king to d1. Where can black deliver a check where it's not going to be captured? a4 is the only place. Now king to e1. Again, where can it deliver a check? a5 or b4. Queen to b4 check, and now king to f1. The king just runs away. Queen to c4 check, and king to g1. And now, because this queen is no longer in contact with this g6 pawn, taking twice with the rooks does not work anymore. And with the extra piece, the king running into the corner, Carlsen is winning, and I actually don't know if this game ended on time or resignation, but computers give white like +8. Obviously, the game is completely over, a huge material advantage, and just another really nice win. Of course, it was nip and tuck. That happens in the jobava-london system and in a blitz game like this, but it's great to see someone rated 2876 playing the jobava-london and doing well with it. And if you thought this was a good game, Magnus has played the jobava-london system before, and if you want to see a really great game where he plays the jobava-london system, be sure to check this game out. You don't want to miss it.